So welcome to the presentation on content in Chapter 3, Social Work Values and Ethics. Many professions have certain ethical standards by which they must abide. Social work has not only a code of ethics, but within that code, a set of values that professionals in the field are expected to embody. The values and principles in the Code of Ethics define and govern social work, informing both practitioners and those who we work with what is expected from people who represent the field. Though the guidelines are extensive and may even seem cumbersome, they are there to protect both clients and social workers. Without them, the discipline of social work would be subject to inconsistency and unpredictability. With them, workers have guidance in the event of ethical dilemmas, and clients can know what to expect from the people charged with their care. So a little bit about the history of the NASW Code of Ethics and its many revisions. So it was established as a code in 1960, and it had 14 original guidelines. It has been revised 8 times. Some of the biggest revisions occurred in 1969, 1979, where 82 guidelines were established. And this is really viewed as the point where the code was modernized. In 2021, that was the most latest revision, and it mostly focused on self-care, but it also incorporated other ideas as well. The code really remains ever-changing and dynamic. And I also wanted to mention that in the first revision in 1967, so this is from the textbook, but I just thought that it was pretty fascinating. A 15th guideline was added, a non-discrimination clause. So this was not until 1967. I will not discriminate because of race, color, religion, age, sex, or national ancestry, and in my job capacity will work to prevent and eliminate such discrimination in rendering service, in work assignments, and in employment practices. So then fast forward until 2008, where the non-discrimination guidelines of the code were expanded to include sexual orientation, gender identity, and immigration status, not until 2008. And in 2017, the code was updated to address issues related to the use of technology. And then again, 2021's revision largely emphasized the importance of social workers' self-care, but also had some other important elements as well. There is a hot link here on the highlighted revisions to the Code of Ethics. If you are interested in this history and how it has evolved, it is very fascinating, and it really gives a sense for the history of the profession. So there are core values of social work. So values are things that are important or desirable to someone, and everyone has them. We have personal values, we have professional values, for example. Social workers' personal values aren't relevant when working with clients. So we don't apply personal values to our clients' lives or the community's lives in which we work. Ethics are guidelines of what's right and wrong in a profession, and morals are our personal ideas of what's right and wrong. So I have linked on the bottom of the slide the Code of Ethics. The Code of Ethics is out there in both Spanish and English, so I have both of those versions linked on this slide that you'll see at the bottom. So now what you see on the slide are the 6 core values of social work. The first is service, and this is basically summarized as a commitment to assist clients in attaining goals by working for the client, this idea that the client comes first and that the client chooses the course of action. So that is how we exude or demonstrate service. Secondly was the social justice, and this is a belief that all deserve equal rights, opportunities, and access to resources. So what are some examples, past or present, of social injustice? Well, one that comes to mind very quickly based on the slide we just, a couple of slides ago, where gender identity and sexual orientation were added to our code in 2008 is certainly an example of injustice. The injustice is experienced by those who identify themselves as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, and intersex. Among other letters and identities that are a part of that community. So that is certainly an injustice that is past and present. The dignity and worth of the person is defined as the clients are worth the social worker's effort and time. So it's really important that social workers be judgment-free in their interactions with clients and communities. And so here it's helpful to think about whether you might have any issues working with certain groups of clients and why, because you at all times have to demonstrate dignity and worth of the person that you're working with. And if you have other feelings towards that person based on something they did or something about who they are, then that is something that needs to be identified and discussed and dealt with. The text talks about this idea of looking glass self by Charles Cooley, where we define ourselves based on how others see and treat us. So how this relates to this value is how can people's views of the client affect how the client sees themselves? If we are reflecting to a client that we have a judgmental standpoint about something that they did or something a part of who they are, then what impact might that have on the way the client sees themselves? It's also really important in this space to recognize limits and work on them. So that is also a component of the core value of dignity and worth. Next is the importance of human relationships. Most important skill in social work is relationship building. We're really good at relationships. We are tuned in to relationships as well. Relationships between clients and social workers, relationships between clients and others, relationships among social workers, relationships with our colleagues, our communities, all those things. And clients must recognize positive and negative relationships as well. So just really centering the importance of human relationships. Fifth is integrity, so being honest and trustworthy, following the code, ensuring that coworkers and organizations remain ethical, and violating trust and ethics can really have a lasting effect. And that is something to be really mindful of. And really is not on a client or a community. They don't bear that burden. Social workers do. So social workers are really charged with developing trust and paying attention to those ethical pieces. And then finally is competence. So we remain committed to learning. We remain committed to improving practical skills and staying abreast of developments within the field. That's one of the reasons why continuing education is so important in social work. So you need it to maintain your licensure. LCSWs in Illinois, for example, require 30 hours every 2 years, at least 3 hours specifically related to ethics, mandated reporter training, and sexual harassment prevention training as well. So competence also demonstrates to the public and to our clients and communities that we're staying up to speed with those pieces. And so we also have an ethical responsibility of self-determination. So this is a client's right to determine the course of action in our work with them, whether it's community or client, except in some circumstances, like when actions or potential actions of a client could lead to a serious, foreseeable, and imminent risk to self or others. Another thing to mention here is that giving advice is not a social worker's job. So we are not in that business because it could have negative effects on a client. So a client takes advice and has a positive result and then becomes dependent on a social worker. A client takes advice and has a negative result and then no longer trusts the client. No longer trusts the social worker. So it really is a lose-lose kind of situation when we quote unquote give advice. So another ethical responsibility we have is to informed consent. It's really important that clients know what to expect in terms of benefits and risk of services, services provided, fees, alternatives, and that they have a right to refuse even for court-ordered services. So this is really, really important to highlight here, is that even in situations where we are working with people who are required to be with us, so in a court-appointed situation, for example, people still have the right to refuse. They have choice in even instances which don't appear to give them choice. And so we have to be really clear about that and explain that so that clients understand it. Informed consent increases understanding, and it keeps language considerations in mind so that everyone is speaking the same language and people understand what's happening and what role they have in it. That's really important in social work. So next we have this ethical responsibility of cultural competence and social diversity and conflicts of interest. So cultural competence and social diversity is an awareness of the effect that culture has on clients and on social workers. And important kind of terms here include ethnocentrism and bias. So this idea, if I'm being ethnocentric, then I am maybe centering my own ethnicity in my interactions with clients, whether they share that ethnicity or identity or not. Additionally, conflicts of interest are places where we can identify and avoid real or perceived impropriety. So we cannot gain financially from interactions with clients except for the salary that we get paid to work with them. It's important that we try to avoid dual relationships. And it's also important to note here that some other relationship or connection dual relationships are instances where there is some other relationship or connection with a client. So this describes a situation in which a social worker has two kinds of relationships with a client. So one as his or her social worker, and then another in some other capacity. So the other relationship could also have been in the past rather than presently active, but it still is something to be aware of. And dual relationships are to be avoided. It is impossible to be truly impartial and objective with a client with whom one has some other sort of relationship. Some dual relationships are strictly prohibited. For instance, one should not be a social worker to one's own friend, relative, coworker, or significant other. Others may be difficult to avoid. For instance, if one lives and works in a rural area, which this is an example that I hear often, there are likely to be fewer agencies that serve particular needs of populations, and so there may not be many referral options to help someone avoid a dual relationship. A social worker may end up having a client whose son is in the same classroom as a social worker's daughter, or who goes to the same place of worship. And in those cases, it just really is essential that the social worker set boundaries that are firm, clear, appropriate, and culturally sensitive. So having the conversation and figuring out what those boundaries look like are also really important. It's also important to avoid treating two people who are in a relationship together. So treating two people separately who are in a relationship together, that could really create a triangle, we say, and that can be problematic as well. So another ethical responsibility to consider is privacy and confidentiality. Privacy and confidentiality is this idea that we only need enough information to best aid the client. So all information must be kept in the strictest of confidence, and it's really important for clients to understand this as well. Social workers are mandated reporters, which means they're required by law to report certain information and only share necessary information is another kind of feature here. So when do folks break confidentiality? Well, we call those instances the three hurts. So client is in danger of hurting self, is in danger of hurting someone else, or someone is going to hurt the client. So those are the three hurts. In addition, child or elder abuse are also instances where we want to break confidentiality. It's also really important to go back to that piece about only needing information to best aid the client, to avoid identifying information when talking to colleagues, students, and other people in the social worker's life. So using general terms only, de-identifying situations as much as possible, again, to protect privacy and confidentiality. So when else can social workers break confidentiality? Well, when a client has signed a release, when it's necessary to obtain payment from a client's insurance carrier, when some crimes have been committed on agency property, or when client notes that they intend to commit a crime. So there is this other ethical issue called the duty to warn, and state law requires some to warn a person who is the target of a specific threat. So that's the duty to warn. So ethical responsibilities to clients kind of continue into sexual relationships. So it is never okay to engage in a romantic sexual relationship with clients, friends, family of clients, or former clients, because there is an extreme risk to mental health of client and of the social worker in these instances. So ethical responsibilities to colleagues include these four ideas. So respect, respecting coworkers, being honest, being as collaborative as possible, interdisciplinary collaboration, so work with professionals in other fields, consultation, so should only be to better aid the client in those consultation situations. And again, going back to privacy and confidentiality, should only share information needed and really try to de-identify it if possible. Referral of services, which is when we refer when others can provide the best service for the client, or in instances of impairment, incompetence, or unethical conduct of colleagues. So helping a colleague may be necessary to report client if no improvement or transgression is significant. So ethical responsibilities in the practice setting include professional supervisors, field supervisors, and administrators. So not engaging in dual relationships, staying within the realm of expertise, overseeing students, and advocating for better resources when possible are all ethical responsibilities when we are in practice setting. And then additional responsibilities in practice settings include paying attention to detail when it comes to client records. So documentation is really important, significant emphasis on written skills. This is why there is a significant emphasis on written skills in social work education. In addition, records must be secure. So how can electronic records be secured? And then retaining client records for a certain amount of time after the client leaves is another piece of this. And finally, a commitment to employers. So following the NASW code, even if place of employment doesn't need to follow it. So kind of making those ethical decisions even when the place of employment doesn't necessarily have it in place. So ethical responsibilities as professionals include private conduct. So social workers are really held to a higher standard, and as such, it's really important, especially now and with the addition of electronic communication into the Code of Ethics in 2017, to be mindful of our social media footprints. And then also impairment. So being unable to complete a job for a variety of reasons, which could be emotional, mental, or physical. So these are our responsibilities as professionals. And then our ethical responsibilities to the profession include being responsible for contributing to foundation of social work and using and modeling best practices whenever we can. Provides us with a QR code and a text number that allows people to check their voter registration status. So, you know, if you're so next is the strengths perspective, and the strengths perspective is pretty paramount to social work's approach to working collaboratively with clients and communities. So it is standard operating procedure for social work. It is needed to avoid solely focusing on the negatives in a client's life, and it increases client empowerment and it increases self-efficacy. It really allows people the space to say, I can change, I can make changes in my life, and I can make improvements in my life on my own. So that's that empowerment and self-efficacy component. So the strengths perspective has 6 principles. The first and foremost is that every client has strengths. And in some instances, we are the only ones in a working relationship who believe that. And so that's really important to keep in mind. Not all strengths may be utilized in the beginning. Some may be considered negative at first. What are some strengths that may, initially be considered negative? I could see one of those being the fact that someone is quote unquote very emotional. And so maybe initially that is viewed as negative because of negative consequences. Maybe that was something that got that person fired from their job. But in the end, that quote unquote emotion is something that drives the passion of that person. And the job they were in was not a good fit. And so when they get into a job or a situation that is a better fit, that passion is really able to blossom as a strength. It's essential to identify client strengths. And sometimes social workers say, this client has no strengths. If that is your perspective, then you may not be the best person for that client, and you may need to take a really deep look at the client and their experiences. So the second principle of the strengths perspective is that trauma, abuse, discrimination, tragedy, and other difficult circumstances are really opportunities for growth. So we consider folks survivors versus victims. So language, again, is important. And we know that clients typically endure a number of challenges. And so we can use knowledge of misfortune to identify strengths. The third principle is that collaboration is best. Working with the client is key, center to empowerment. It's center to this perspective. Why? Because it helps clients develop a way to reach their own goals. It increases their buy-in and ownership. A client knows themselves the best. We don't know the client as well as they do. So to partner with them, to collaborate with them, whether it's a client or a community, is key to success. And it's too much pressure for a social worker to be responsible for each client's fate. You have to collaborate and work in partnership. So a fourth principle is not to assume that you know the limits of a client's capacity for change. So don't limit a client. You limit a client when you underestimate them. You decrease the likelihood of their success. Clients don't need more discouragement. Encourage realistic goals. So you can do this from, a social worker can do this from that perspective, that they're encouraging realistic goals. The fifth principle is that every environment has resources. So encourage clients to look for opportunities in their own environment. That is a way to apply the strengths perspective at that more community or environmental level. And then finally, language is so important. Word choice can inspire or limit people. Promoting usage of positive words, modeling that in your interactions, in a social worker's interactions with clients and community members is really important.